The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was a place of light, music, and ego. Representatives from 1,000 alien races sat in golden chairs, boasting about their advanced technology and ancient history. In the center of the hall stood Ambassador Sarah Thorne. She was a human, small and fragile compared to the four-armed giants and crystalline beings around her. For an hour, the council had been laughing. They were celebrating the anniversary of the Kraxen Empire, the strongest military force in the sector. The Kraxen had built a Dyson shell around their sun, a cage of metal that captured every drop of energy. It was supposed to be the most unhackable, indestructible fortress in existence. To the Kraxen, shouted the High Archon of the Xylos, to a species that has finally conquered the stars. But Sarah Thorne did not cheer. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on a datapad in her hand. Her face was pale. She looked like someone watching a funeral, not a party. Suddenly, the music stopped. The giant holographic map in the center of the room flickered. The bright gold representing the Kraxen home system, the 7 suns, didn't just dim. It vanished. The room went cold. 1,000 sensors on the council's wall turned red. Technical error, the High Archon muttered, his many hands waving dismissively. The Kraxen probably tripped a breaker. Their power is too great for our sensors to track. It's not an error, Sarah Thorne's voice rang out. It wasn't loud, but it had a sharpness that cut through the murmurs. They're gone. The aliens turned to her, some sneering. Little human, a reptilian senator hissed. The Kraxen have shields that can withstand a supernova. Nothing can destroy them in a single second. I didn't say they were destroyed, Sarah replied, walking toward the central podium. I said they're gone. There is no debris. There are no distress signals. There isn't even a heat signature left in that sector of space. 7 stars and 12 billion people have been erased from the map. She tapped her datapad, and a recorder began to play over the speakers. It wasn't sound humans could hear with their ears, but the translation software turned it into a low, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like a heartbeat, or perhaps a giant chewing. This was recorded by a human deep space buoy 5 minutes ago, Sarah said. The council watched the screen, where the Kraxen Empire used to be. There was now only a perfect, terrifying circle of absolute blackness. It was darker than the void of space. It looked like a hole torn in the fabric of reality. For 3 centuries, my people have been watching the edges of the galaxy, Sarah told the stunned crowd. While you were building monuments to yourselves, we were listening to the darkness. We call this the Entropy Maw. It doesn't fight. It doesn't negotiate. It simply eats. She looked at the High Archon, her eyes filled with a grim warning. You think you are gods? You are just snacks. And this is officially your extinction event. The silence in the Great Hall lasted only a few seconds before it was replaced by an explosion of angry voices. The High Archon slammed his heavy fist onto the table, the sound echoing like a cannon shot. Panic-mongering, he roared. Humanity has always been a race of scavengers and alarmists. You find a shadow in the dark and claim the universe is ending just so we will look at you. The other senators joined in. They pointed to their massive fleets, their antimatter missiles, and their shields that could bounce back the heat of a sun. To them, the disappearance of the Kraxen was a mystery to be solved with math and sensors, not a monster to be feared. They refused to believe that anything could exist that they could not kill. Sarah Thorne stood her ground, watching the chaos with a tired expression. We sent you the data decades ago, she said, her voice steady. We told you the gravity ripples were getting closer. We showed you the dead zones where stars used to be. You called it stellar drift. You ignored us because the truth was too expensive to fix. The High Archon ignored her. He turned to his generals. Send the Xylos' first expeditionary fleet. If there's a hole in space, we will fill it with fire. We will show this Maw the strength of a real civilization. As the council watched on the giant view screen, the Xylos fleet, the pride of the galaxy, jumped into the sector where the Kraxen once lived. 500 massive warships appeared, their hulls glowing with golden light. They looked invincible. They began firing long-range probes into the black void. For a moment, nothing happened. The senators began to smirk. See, The reptilian senator whispered. It is just a vacuum, a gravity fluke. Then the thumping sound from the human recording started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was a vibration that everyone in the room could feel in their bones. On the screen, the black circle didn't move, but the space around it began to warp. The golden Xylos ships didn't explode. They didn't burn. Instead, they began to stretch. The metal hulls turned into long, thin ribbons of light, pulled toward the center of the darkness. The screams of the Xylos pilots came through the comms, a horrific, distorted screech that sounded like metal being torn by teeth. The High Archon watched in horror as his invincible fleet was sucked into the void like water down a drain. It took less than a minute. 500 ships gone. Not a single piece of scrap metal remained. The black hole seemed to pulse, growing slightly larger. It was moving now, drifting slowly toward the center of the inhabited galaxy. Sarah Thorne looked at the High Archon, who had collapsed into his seat, his face a mask of shock. "Your fire didn't hurt it," Sarah said softly. "It just fed it. You gave it 500 ship cores worth of energy. You just invited it to dinner, and the rest of the galaxy is the main course." She turned to leave the hall. "The Council's time for leading is over. If you want to live, you'll stop acting like gods and start acting like survivors." The Great Hall was no longer a place of celebration. It was a room filled with the smell of fear. Holographic displays across the galaxy showed the same terrifying image. The Maw was moving. It was a wandering grave, a silent predator that left nothing but empty space in its wake. The High Archon looked up as Sarah Thorne walked toward the exit. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Human, Thorne, you said your people have been tracking this. You said you knew it was coming. If your primitive sensors could see it, then surely your primitive weapons can stop it." Sarah stopped and turned around. "We don't have weapons that can kill a tear in reality," she said bluntly. "Nobody does. You spent your history trying to build bigger guns to kill each other. We spent our history looking at the stars and realizing how small we were. We knew we couldn't outfight the universe, so we decided to outwork it." She waved her hand, and a new image appeared on the Council's main screen. It wasn't a warship. It was a star system at the very edge of the human sector. At the center was a small, dying white dwarf star. Surrounding it was a structure so massive it made the Kraxen Dyson shell look like a toy. Millions of human ships, tiny industrial tugs and construction drones, were buzzing around it like ants. They weren't building a city or a fortress. They were building millions of massive, engine-like pylons that stretched deep into the star's core. "This is Project Sentinel," Sarah explained. "For 300 years, every human child had been taught that the Great Dark was coming. We didn't build luxury cruise ships or golden palaces. We spent every resource, every ounce of gold, and every hour of labor on this. We turned an entire solar system into a machine." "A machine for what?" the reptilian senator asked, his scales dull with terror. "To hide." "No," Sarah said, a spark of pride finally appearing in her eyes. "To pull. We realize the Maw follows the strongest gravity and energy signatures. It's a blind beast following the scent of power. You all just lit a giant signal fire by sending your fleet to attack it. It's coming for the Council Heart World now, because this is where the most life is." She leaned over the podium. "While you were arguing about taxes and borders, humanity was building a shield. We're going to use Project Sentinel to create a gravity well so strong it will rip the Maw off its path. We're going to offer ourselves as a bait." The room went silent. The aliens couldn't understand it. Why would a weak race sacrifice their home, their projects, and their lives for a galaxy that had mocked them? "You're going to lead it to yourselves?" the High Archon whispered. "You'll be destroyed." "We've been preparing to die for 3 centuries, Sarah replied. "That's the difference between us. You fought to rule the galaxy. We work to make sure the galaxy survives." The Maw was no longer a distant threat. It had reached the inner rim. The sky above the Council's capital planet had turned a sickening shade of bruised purple. Gravity began to fail. In the streets below, buildings began to groan as their foundations were pulled upward. People weren't just dying. They were being unmade. In the command center Project Sentinel, millions of miles away, the atmosphere was different. There was no screaming. There was only the steady click of keyboards and the calm voices of human engineers. Maw contact in T-minus 10 minutes, a technician reported. Ambassador Thorne was no longer in the Great Hall. She was on the bridge of the UEFS Defiance, a ship that looked like a jagged block of industrial steel. On her screen, she could see the Council's leadership. They were huddled in their bunkers, watching the end of their world through shaky cameras. Humanity, the High Archon's voice came through the comms, trembling. The Maw is here. Our sensors say it is too large. Your machine won't be enough. Watch, Sarah said. It was a simple command. On the scanners, the dead star at the center of Project Sentinel began to change. The millions of pylons humanity had spent centuries building began to glow. They weren't firing lasers. Instead, they were pumping massive amounts of exotic matter into the dying star's core. Suddenly, the white dwarf didn't explode. It imploded, then expanded into a controlled, artificial singularity. It was a gravity anchor. All units engage, Sarah commanded. Thousands of human tug ships ignited their engines. These weren't warships with cannons. They were massive engines with cockpits. They hooked onto gravity web and began to pull. They weren't pulling the Maw. They were pulling the very fabric of space itself. It was like a cosmic tug-of-war. The Maw, sensing the massive surge of energy from the human project, paused its feast on the Council's world. Like a shark sensing blood in the water, the darkness turned. It felt the pulse of the Sentinel. The human pilots knew the risks. To create a gravity well strong enough to move the Maw, they had to stay incredibly close to the event horizon. One mistake, one engine flicker, and they would be swallowed in an instant. We are losing ships on perimeter, a flight officer shouted. Hold the line, Sarah said, her hands gripping her chair. If we blink, the Maw goes back to the inhabited systems. We're the only thing it sees right now. We have to be the loudest thing in the universe. Across the galaxy, billions of aliens watched their screens. They saw the tiny human ships, like fireflies against a storm, standing between the darkness and the rest of living civilization. For the first time in history, the superior races realized they weren't being saved by a god or a miracle. They were being saved by the sheer, stubborn will of a race that refused to give up. The Maw hit the human gravity barrier with the force of a collapsing reality. The sky near Project Sentinel didn't just turn dark, it screamed. The human gravity anchor pulsed with a blinding, white-hot light as it struggled to hold a monster in place. On the monitors, the tiny dots representing human ships were vanishing by the hundreds every second. The anchor is holding. The lead engineer shouted over the roar of vibrating metal. But the Maw is fighting back. It's trying to swallow the star. Sarah Thorne watched as her fleet was pulverized. These were her people. Engineers, miners, and pilots who had spent their entire lives preparing for this single minute of sacrifice. They weren't dying for glory. They were dying so that billions of strangers on distant planets could wake up tomorrow. Release the final charge, Sarah ordered. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of her entire species. Deep inside the Sentinel star, a series of nova bombs detonated. This wasn't meant to destroy the Maw. You cannot blow up a hole in space. Instead, it was designed to give the Maw exactly what it wanted, a massive, concentrated burst of pure energy. It was a poison pill. The explosion was silent. A wave of white energy surged outward, pushing the Maw back, forcing it to choke on more power than it could consume. The vacuum recoiled. The tear in reality began to seal itself, pushed away by the sheer pressure of a human-made star. With a final, violent ripple that shook every planet in the galaxy, the Maw vanished, flung back into the deep, dark void of intergalactic space. Silence returned to the bridge of the Defiance. The sensors were dead. The Sentinel star was gone. The millions of human tug ships were nothing but dust. A flickering hologram appeared on the bridge. It was a High Archon. He was crying. Around him, the Council capital was safe. The purple sky was gone. The gravity had returned to normal. You did it, the High Archon whispered. Humanity, You saved us all. Your fleet, your project, it's all gone. How can we ever repay you?" Sarah Thorne looked into the camera. She looked older now, her face lined with the grief of a leader who had just lost everything. "We didn't do this for payment," Sarah said, her voice cold and hard as steel. "And we didn't do it because we're your friends. We did it because we are humans. We have spent our history surviving fires, floods, and wars. We knew that when the universe finally came to turn out the lights, someone would have to be brave enough to hold a match." She leaned closer to the transmitter, her message broadcasting to every surviving world in the galaxy. "Let this be humanity's last warning. We have shown you what it takes to survive. We have shown you that your godlike technology is nothing compared to the will to stand your ground. This was your extinction event. We bought you a second chance with the lives of our best people." She paused, her eyes flashing with a final, gripping promise. "Don't make us have to save you again. Because next time, we might just decide to let the darkness eat." The screen went black. Across the galaxy, the superior races looked at the empty space where the humans had stood, and for the first time in history, they felt truly small.